If you think the Supreme Court moves slowly, think again. In the middle of chaos, without warning, all 9 justices just agreed on one emergency ruling. No dissents, no splits. One decision that instantly changed the legal ground beneath millions of Americans, and almost no one is talking about what it really means. What makes this moment so extraordinary isn't just the outcome, it's the speed. Emergency rulings are rare. Unanimous emergency rulings are even rarer. And when all 9 justices across every ideological line speak with one voice, it's usually a signal that something much bigger is at stake. This wasn't about politics. It wasn't about left versus right. It was about power, authority, and how the law functions when the system is under stress. To understand why this decision matters nationwide, you first have to understand what an emergency ruling actually is. The Supreme Court doesn't normally act like a firefighter. Most cases take months, sometimes years, to wind their way through lower courts before reaching the justices. An emergency order bypasses that entire process. It's the court saying this cannot wait. Whatever is happening right now is so serious that letting it continue would cause irreversible damage. That alone should get your attention. But here's where it gets even more significant. Emergency orders are often decided quietly, sometimes late at night, and frequently with sharp dissents. You'll usually see a 5-4 split, sometimes 6-3. A unanimous 9-0 decision tells us that the legal issue wasn't even close. In the eyes of every justice, something crossed a clear constitutional or legal line. This is the Supreme Court drawing a boundary, and boundaries, once drawn at this level, tend to last. What kind of situation forces that kind of unity? Typically, it's when a lower court, a state government, or a federal agency moves in a way that threatens the balance of power itself. It might involve elections, enforcement authority, constitutional rights, or the scope of executive power. Whatever the specific trigger, the message from the court is the same: stop. This goes no further. That message doesn't just apply to the parties involved. It sends shockwaves outward. Judges across the country take note. State officials adjust their strategies. Federal agencies quietly revise internal guidance. Lawyers rewrite arguments overnight. A single emergency order can reshape how cases are handled nationwide long before the public even realizes what changed. And here's the part most headlines miss. A unanimous ruling like this isn't just about resolving a dispute. It's about signaling future outcomes. The court is effectively telling the legal world, if this comes back to us in a full case, don't expect a different answer. That kind of signal changes behavior immediately. Think about the incentive structure. If you're a state considering pushing the limits of your authority, this ruling just narrowed your room to maneuver. If you're a federal agency testing how far emergency powers can stretch, the court just reminded you where the ceiling is. Even private institutions feel it, because regulatory uncertainty suddenly snaps into focus. This is how the Supreme Court shapes reality without passing a sweeping new law. One short order, a few pages, no oral arguments, no cameras, and yet the impact ripples through courts, governments, and markets alike. That's why this decision matters far beyond the case itself. It reveals how the court sees its role in moments of institutional stress. It shows what lines are non-negotiable, and it exposes which arguments no longer have a future in front of these 9 justices. But to really understand what changed and who this ruling helps or hurts, you have to look at what the court was actually protecting and why it moved so fast in the first place. Because when courts act this urgently, they're usually trying to prevent a domino effect. One bad ruling left standing too long can spread. Other judges cite it, agencies rely on it, states copy it, and suddenly what began as a narrow dispute becomes a nationwide precedent without ever being fully tested. The Supreme Court understands that risk better than anyone. That's why emergency intervention is often less about the case in front of them and more about stopping the damage before it multiplies. In this situation, the justices were confronted with a lower court decision that, in their view, distorted the law in a way that could not be allowed to stand even temporarily. It wasn't a close call. It wasn't a novel theory deserving time to develop. It was a misapplication serious enough that leaving it in place, even for a few weeks, would create confusion across the country. That's the unspoken logic behind unanimity. Every justice saw the same threat, and that threat usually comes down to structure. Who has the authority to act? Who doesn't? And what happens when those boundaries are ignored? The court is especially sensitive to moments where one branch of government tries to expand power through emergency logic. History has shown that emergencies are where constitutional limits are most often tested and sometimes quietly broken. That's why this ruling carries weight far beyond the immediate parties. It reinforces a principle that the court has been sharpening for years. Emergency power does not mean unlimited power. Speed does not excuse overreach. And urgency does not replace legality. Those ideas may sound abstract, but they have very real consequences for how laws are enforced on the ground. Imagine a state official deciding whether to move forward with a controversial enforcement action. Before this ruling, there might have been legal gray space, conflicting lower court opinions, uncertainty about how far authority could stretch. After a 9-0 emergency order, that gray space shrinks dramatically. The risk calculation changes. What once seemed defensible suddenly looks reckless. The same applies to federal agencies. Internal legal teams watch these orders closely. A unanimous emergency ruling is read as a warning flare. It tells them not just what the law is today, but how the Supreme Court is likely to rule tomorrow. That shapes rulemaking, enforcement priorities, and even settlement decisions behind closed doors. There's also a psychological effect. The public often views the Supreme Court as deeply divided, and in many cases, that perception is accurate. But moments like this remind everyone that certain legal foundations still command universal agreement. When those foundations are threatened, ideology fades into the background. Institutional stability takes priority. That's why this ruling landed so forcefully. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was decisive, and decisive rulings tend to linger. Lawyers will cite this order in briefs. Judges will reference it in opinions. And future litigants will think twice before advancing arguments that resemble the ones just unanimously rejected. What's happening here is subtle but powerful. The court is narrowing the field. Certain legal strategies are effectively being taken off the table. Certain shortcuts are being closed. And once that happens, the legal landscape doesn't snap back to the way it was before. The real question now isn't what this ruling stopped. It's what it set in motion next. Because what follows an emergency ruling like this is often more important than the order itself. Once the court steps in unanimously, the legal system recalibrates. Pending cases that rely on similar arguments quietly lose momentum. Appeals are reconsidered. Strategies shift. In some instances, lawsuits are dropped entirely, not because a final ruling has been issued, but because everyone involved can already see the writing on the wall. This is how the Supreme Court exerts influence without spectacle. It doesn't need a sweeping opinion or a landmark oral argument to change behavior. It just needs to make its position unmistakably clear. A 9-0 vote does exactly that. It removes ambiguity. And in law, removing ambiguity is power. For ordinary Americans, the impact is less visible but no less real. Rules that might have changed overnight are frozen. Enforcement actions that could have expanded suddenly stop. Rights that were at risk of being narrowed are preserved, at least for now. Even people who never read the order are affected by the stability it creates. There's also a longer-term implication that deserves attention. When the court acts unanimously in an emergency, it strengthens the legitimacy of the institution itself. In a time when public trust in institutions is fragile, consensus matters. It signals that some principles are still shared, that the rule of law isn't just a talking point, but a framework the justices are willing to defend together when it's tested. This doesn't mean future cases will be unanimous. They won't be. Deep divisions still exist, but this ruling draws a bright line around a specific issue and says this far, and no further. That line will now shape how similar disputes are resolved for years, even decades. And that's why this decision deserves attention, not because it was dramatic, but because it was definitive, not because it grabbed headlines, but because it quietly reset expectations nationwide. When the Supreme Court speaks with one voice in a moment of urgency, it's not just resolving a dispute. It's stabilizing the system. This unanimous 9-0 emergency ruling is a reminder of how real power actually works in the legal system. It's not always loud. It's not always televised. Sometimes it's a short order that arrives without warning and instantly changes what's possible and what's not. The Supreme Court didn't just decide a case here, it drew a boundary that governments, agencies, courts, and citizens now have to live with. And when all 9 justices agree on where that boundary lies, the impact doesn't fade with the news cycle. It becomes part of the legal foundation of the country.